One of the earliest memories I have of seeing a classic Western play was a production of Henrik Ibsen's An Enemy of the People when I was about 10 years old at a small professional theater in Portland, Oregon. My parents had been taking me to see adult theater since I was quite small, since they discovered, quite accidentally after a babysitter canceled, that 4-year-old me could sit still and be quiet through 3 hours of Shakespeare. With that track record, why not take 10-year-old me to see a complex piece of pathos and social commentary like the Norwegian Ibsen always delivers? So I don't really remember much about the intricacies of the plot and how the characters' relationships gradually disintegrated. But I do remember having the distinct impression that the principal character, Dr. Stockman, a scientist and researcher in an unnamed Scandinavian town, was trying very hard to right a terrible wrong that was going to affect his entire community. Years later, when I returned to this play in a drama history class in college, I was reminded of what exactly happens in it and how many stories have actually been spun off from this famous tale for its moral commentary. It goes something like this. It's the late 19th century, and the town is about to unveil a large public bathing system appealing to both healthy and sick individuals, which will be an economic boon for all. Dr. Stockman has been doing research around the safety of the baths and finds that due to some questionable shortcuts in building, the water is severely contaminated. What complicates this issue is that Dr. Stockman's brother is the mayor of the town, whose idea it was to build and open the baths, and the contamination turns out to be coming from the prosperous local tannery owned and operated by none other than Dr. Stockman's father-in-law. To make matters even messier, the whole town has backed the mayor's idea for the baths and anxiously awaits the project's opening, which took huge sums of money and time. While the play has layers of commentary about the nature of democracy, class, the power of the press, and ethics, Ibsen has presented a clear moral dilemma for our hero. What does he do when the right thing to do will harm on many levels before it helps? In Dr. Stockman's case, he takes a firm and unwavering stand against the will of the majority. Though his brother urges him to consider the implications of ruining the reputation of the town's government and potentially the economy, even suggesting that they might correct the problem gradually and quietly while continuing to keep the business open, Stockman is fully committed to the greater public health crisis involved and compelled to reveal what he sees as a criminal act of negligence, even if it destabilized the leadership and brought disgrace to his brother and his father-in-law. Surely the town will see him as saving them from disaster in the end, he proposes. Ironically, the exact opposite happens when he realizes that the local newspaper will not print the results of his research, and so he speaks out at a town meeting on the matter. Instead of ingratiating the people to his moral call, his criticism of corruption in the leadership and willful harm to its people ends up insulting the entire town, who turns against him. He and his family are alienated as he is declared an enemy of the people, exiled from town. In his moral grandeur, he refuses to leave, instead choosing to pick up the literal pieces of his vandalized home and the figurative pieces of a life dismantled by his choice to make a difficult moral stand. So it was that I was reminded of this story while reading the book of Jeremiah's sweeping prophecies for 7th century Israel. Set against a backdrop of heavy transition for multiple nations as Assyria and Babylon battled for power, Jeremiah was called by God to prophesy to both Israel in the north and Judah in the south. The northern kingdom of Israel was, as history unfolded, about to lose its relative independence under the Assyrian Empire as the Neo-Babylonian Empire invaded and then subsequently headed south for Judah, where Jeremiah resided. Poor Jeremiah, who was born into a priestly class of elites that comprised the leadership of Judah, began to prophesy around the 13th year of King Josiah's reign, as it goes, perhaps 627 or 626 BCE. This is weird only because it wasn't looking like much unrest at that time was going to affect them. The Babylonian exile didn't even begin, as you might recall, for around another 30 years. So when Jeremiah reluctantly and with great sadness began his witness, preaching that a threat from the north was making its way south because the people had turned from God, the people were not too open to hearing this, and understandably so. Everything was relatively stable for both Israel and Judah, where King Josiah was largely considered a great theological leader of the Judean nation. Josiah implemented a religious reformation just a few years after the beginning of Jeremiah's prophecy, where he stressed purification of all religious practices of any pagan rituals, recentered rites of sacrifice in the Jerusalem temple itself, and generally was known as a righteous king in his implementation of social justice reform as a kind of ritual return to the law of God as it was intended to be. This seems pretty good to me, but like our other suffering prophetic servants in Hebrew tradition, even when the good times were rolling, Jeremiah was spiritually compelled to see only the terrible underbelly of a society in which there was any compromise at all of God's commandments to enact justice. The justice that always manifests in the form of actively resisting the exploitation of the vulnerable. Good enough for the prophetic voice is simply moral relativism, and it cannot withstand the expectations of the God of liberation. And since prophecy in the Hebrew tradition is focused less on foretelling what is going to happen and more about pointing out what is already going on, Jeremiah was compelled to shed light on that very underbelly in order to answer the high call, as Jewish Talmudic tradition goes, to be a people who are more than just a people. To strive toward embodying the ways of God from the inside out, no matter how long, no matter how exhausting, and no matter how impossible such a task really is. But Jeremiah also realized that the word he received from God was alienating him from society because it was exactly what the people didn't want to hear. Nevertheless, he answered the call. For this reason, he is often called the weeping prophet, because he wrote about the sting of personal injury in a mission that would make him an outcast, as well as the moral outrage of a society that had sold itself out on multiple levels, beginning with the worshiping of other gods, but ending with the outright bulldozing, even to the point of murder of the poor and the orphan and the widow. Jeremiah is left to funnel God's wrath and survive the people's wrath in order to do what he knew was right. It is thus that rabbinic philosopher Abraham Joshua Heschel asks, was Jeremiah an enemy of the people? Like Dr. Stockman of Ibsen's classic tale, Jeremiah risked everything because he was compelled to right terrible wrongs. Doing what God commanded him to do, Jeremiah laments the fall of Jerusalem and his physical and social exile from his home and his people. Woe is me, my mother, that you ever bore me, he cries. A man of strife and contention to the whole land. I have not lent, nor have I borrowed, yet all of them curse me. Dr. Stockman, when given his prophetic moment to declare the truth that he saw as crucial to his town's survival, quickly discovered that its unpopularity was going to leave him to fend for himself. Jeremiah suffered imprisonment and attempts on his life from his own people, while Stockman similarly ended up with no job, no friends, a vandalized home, and an entire town that didn't want him. But where Ibsen finishes the story with his courageous protagonist literally standing alone to tersely conclude, "The strongest man in the world is the man who stands most alone," our prophetic tradition leaves us with a bit of a different message, a vision that I would argue is fuller, more sustainable, and less cynical than that which lies with the individual only. It is a vision that stakes its claim in the inherent morality of humanity, the hope, the expectation that we indeed can be, must be a people who are more than just a people. Despite the alienation from his land and his people, Jeremiah receives from God a word of restoration in the form of a communal reprieve. "The days are surely coming, says the Lord, when I will restore the fortunes of my people, Israel and Judah. Out of them shall come thanksgiving and the sound of merrymakers." Of course, this word does not come without the agreement that the people must make in order to be in right relationship with God, and thus with each other and the world around them. By the time we get to our chapter for this morning, God has made a promise and is ready to lay out the expectations in return. "It will not be like the covenant that I made with their ancestors when I took them by the hand to bring them out of the land of Egypt." Instead, God has a new tactic, an approach from the inside out. "I will put the law within them, and I will write it on their hearts." Instead of an externalized moral code that the people continue to break, what if the covenant came from within? A morality that begins with a heart that identifies and responds to cruelty, a heart that acknowledges and resists injustice of any kind, such that it cannot be moved by external forces. Such a morality as God envisions will sustain both individual and community, for no longer will they have to teach each other or to say to each other, "Know the Lord," for they will all know the Lord. Such a morality that knows God innately is one that automatically checks itself by not simply repudiating white supremacy, but fighting voter restriction and mass incarceration. By not simply decrying the unequal treatment of women, but demanding equal pay and the health care that we deserve. By not simply renouncing religious intolerance, but showing up at the airport to protest travel bans. By not simply rejecting environmental ravaging, but reducing our carbon footprint every single day. This kind of morality, the law that is written on our hearts, is one that transcends the personage of the prophet and the particularities of various cultural populisms to answer to a vision beyond what is easiest and beyond what is most popular in the moment. A vision that recognizes from deep within that the needs of our brothers and sisters of humanity are the same as our own needs. That recognizes that the right to live and to live well is not simply my right, but a birthright for all human beings. This past Wednesday, students across the country walked out of their various schools for 17 minutes, both to honor the lives of the 17 students killed at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School in Parkland, Florida, but also as a demand of our legislators to end school shootings. Like any movement, this one had its supporters and had its antagonists, but what I think is really important to note about this action is that the inspiration for its demonstration was particular. Created and led by our youth, these students acted out of an internal sense that no child should die or witness the death of their peers in the very place that is supposed to keep them safe. It is a knowledge that transcends the political issues and conversations by addressing the moral issue at stake. The right for each person to live and to live well. But it wasn't the number of students that participated in this new movement that was the most impressive. It was how many did it in towns and schools that were not supportive of the action. Justin Blackman of North Carolina spent the time outside and tweeted to show that he was alone, but stayed to bear witness. Rosa Rodriguez of New Jersey also walked out alone despite the principal threatening to suspend her. Second grader Leonardo Aguilar of Northern California walked out with a sign and joined the high school students down the street from his elementary school because he was the only one. But one little girl in a town down south had to be accompanied by a teacher when the other students began taunting and making fun of her. Her mother, concerned for her daughter's well-being, came to the school grounds to stand nearby, but not to stand with her. This little girl stayed where she was, despite the jeering of her classmates, and feeling, I can only imagine, utterly alone. Yet while all these remarkable kids stood alone physically, they were sustained by the knowledge that their peers across the nation were also moved from within their hearts to do something on a national level as a prophetic demonstration to force the adults around them to re-examine exactly where their values lie. We might take a cue from our amazing children when we feel our fortitude faltering, when we feel the bitter pull of exhaustion from the weight of the world's injustices or our own interpersonal failings. We might take a cue from our own son, Ermias, who spoke publicly for what is right, who spoke for the lives of others at his young age. We might look to our children in this incredibly divisive era as a reminder that yes, we are inherently moral beings, and that across cultures and religions and languages, the covenant of respect, the covenant that recognizes the other as a part of ourselves, the covenant of understanding that we cannot flourish when others are kept from flourishing, is written on the hearts of all human beings. We just have to dig deep enough to find it. And after looking to our children to remind us of this, may we look to each other and take comfort in this community. Because when one of us is faltering in our covenant, another is always there to hold us up, to remember with us what's written on our hearts, to show us exactly who God is, no matter what insanity we may be facing. As Jewish Talmudic tradition reminds us, do not be daunted by the enormity of the world's grief. Do justly now. Love mercy now. Walk humbly now. You are not obligated to complete the work, but neither are you free to abandon it.